Hear me? Can you still hear me? Well, welcome to the great debate. This is not an oral session where you're going to see some talks. You're just going to receive some short position statements given by our invited speakers here. And the bulk of the program will be to get questions from you. Whilst it would be great to hear what these guys have got to say, it would be even better if you can push them a little bit. I didn't mention that, did I? And you can actually find out what you need to know about getting real about energy. First of all, my name's Paul Quinn. I'm from the School of Civil Engineering and Geosciences at Newcastle University in England. And I traditionally work with farms and farming communities. And at some stage, I thought, we need to put micro-renewable energy on farms. You can produce food, you can produce energy. And so I've put a series of schemes in on farms, and then I suggested, look, everybody, this is a great idea. Why don't we do it everywhere? Which went thumbs down. It's just impossible to get these things going. And so that's the reason why we want to get real about energy. We need to discuss what are the barriers that are getting in the way. Okay, so basically it was organized by The Great Debate, which is an organization in Newcastle. Been running for 12 years. It's run by Dr. Casper Hewitt, who unfortunately cannot be here today, but I believe he's on the webcam. So if we could all say hello, Casper. Hello, Casper. Thank you. And he says I've got to keep to time and not say anything silly. Okay, so the idea is that we're going to talk about energy. So it's in the context of climate change, but this is not a climate change debate. We're interested in energy, that it's vital. We need to think about renewables. Is it realistic? Should we be going down the nuclear option? What about fossil fuels? Is it the reality that we must continue with fossil fuels? And how do we set targets? And how do we make things work? What are the carbon emissions we're talking about? So we need a rationale for now, the near future, and the long-term future. And we need to think, what are the real issues? And we need your help for that. And are we just dreaming about energy and renewables? How do we get real about energy? So the format's going to be quite simple. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers to come up here and to speak and give a position statement for 8 minutes. And then they will stop. And then after that, they will have a short period just to contemplate what has been said once all three speakers have spoken. And then it's over to you guys. We really want your questions. Okay, so if you can keep your questions short and clear, and we'll probably take 3 or 4 questions depending on the length of the question and how complicated it is. And then we'll ask our panel to respond to it, or to aspects to it, or to discuss maybe the fact that the questions are related. So, without further ado, I'm going to call upon Dermot to give a position statement. Now, Dermot joined Newcastle University in August 2007 as Science City Professor of Energy. That sounds fantastic, doesn't it? Science City. Do you know what it is yet, Science City? I do. Okay. He is also director of the Sir Joseph Swan Institute for Energy Research. He was formerly chief executive of Renew Tees Valley Limited, a company which he himself set up in 2003 to create a viable and vibrant economy in the Tees Valley in the UK based on renewable energy and recycling. The company's interests include a range of renewable energy technologies, hydrogen, liquid and solid biofuels, and a range of recycling and advanced waste processing technologies. Prior to that, he ran the Petro Plus crude oil refinery on Teesside, worked in the Netherlands on Petro Plus international growth plans, worked in the chemical industry for 17 years and in a variety of local and international roles in operations, engineering and technology, and developed a leading-edge technology at Queen's University Belfast for optimization and control in aerospace applications. Dermot.
Thank you. Good afternoon. You're getting real about energy. I guess we're trying to address 3 problems at the same time. One is the price of fossil fuels, they're trending up in a volatile manner. A second is energy security, and the third is climate change, and you can put those in your favourite order. People disagree on that. But if in addressing those 3 problems we can extract economic opportunities at the same time, then we might just manage to get real about energy and energy solutions. Now, when I talk about energy, I'm really talking about three different things in equal measure. I'm talking about electricity, I'm talking about heat for homes, factories, processes, and so on, and I'm talking about transport fuels. I talk about all three because all three contribute roughly equally to CO2 emissions, and because all three contribute roughly equally to our consumption of fossil fuels. So I'm looking at all three at the same time. If we want to get real about energy, I think, particularly on the renewable side, I think we have to look at the right renewables in the right places. So when people start to talk about, for example, biomass solutions in Finland or Austria, we've got huge tree cover, I think that's a good starting point. If people talk about geothermal energy in Iceland, I think that's a good, sensible starting point. If people are looking at solar PV solutions in Spain, in southern African countries, I think, yeah, that sounds like the right natural resource in the right place. In Scotland, you're more likely to look at offshore wind solutions, wave power and whatnot, because of its geographical location. In the UK, where I come from, we know that we've got 40% of Europe's wind. We know that we've got 50% of Europe's tidal stream resource. So if you want to be real about this, you have to start with the right technologies in the right place. And then you can link it through to jobs and create some kind of economic prosperity. Then people will actually invest. Just to give a feel for some of the recent encouraging developments in the UK, there's a lot of doors have suddenly opened in respect of offshore wind energy. Round 3 licenses have been awarded. They stretch right out 208 kilometres to Dogger Bank. And we're seeing the investment following through with Clipper Wind investing in northeast England close to these facilities and signs of some other investors coming in as well, creating real jobs. 50,000 real jobs is actually what you can shoot for there. The other big thing that we've seen, because we've been copying continental Europe now, is we've copied the idea of feed-in tariffs. And suddenly that's opened some doors where they've been set at the right level. So with solar PV, we're finding that people are going straight to 5 megawatt schemes in brownfield sites and doing it on a grand scale. It's not working for anaerobic digestion. The level was just set too low. One of the questions that was on the agenda for today really is, where does nuclear fit in? Well, if you're thinking 3 types of energy, electricity, heat and transport, it certainly does nothing for heat because people want to keep nuclear power stations so far away you can't possibly use any of the heat that's produced for anything other than power generation. At the limits, it might contribute somewhat to electrical vehicles insofar as that might displace liquid fossil fuels. So it's only going to be part of the solution, but it can be part of that solution. In the UK, for electricity in 1997, it was 26% of the grid mix. It's now 13%. It might get back up to about a quarter, but that's a quarter of electricity, and it was less than 10% of energy. And even there, nuclear is really for base load. You don't wind rates up and down drastically on nuclear power stations. They're not for that. There are issues around long-term storage of waste, a bunch of geoscience. People know more about that than I do, but those issues are very real. And there is a question about whether we're sending the wrong signal if we push really hard for nuclear. The other big issue is that we have to match to a very variable electricity demand, and the renewables won't do that on their own, and so something has to take up the slack in the middle. That becomes either biomass or fossil fuels, coal and gas. You could make a very strong case for clean coal. I hope that comes up in the question so I don't have to cover it all here. But I simply can't see China choosing not to use its huge coal reserves, nor the United States, former Soviet Union, Australia, India. The only saviour environmentally is if we can use them in connection with carbon capture and storage, so I hope we do actually debate that. The other thing I would draw attention to is underground coal gasification, because we've actually got 18 trillion tonnes of coal on the planet. You can't mine all of that, but you can access a lot of that with directional drilling technology and bring a synthesis gas to the surface, a mixture of hydrogen and carbon monoxide, and suddenly then you can do fuel synthesis, you can do heat and power generation if you want to. You can link that to carbon capture and storage if that's what you want to do, but the scale is 18 trillion tonnes of coal, not the tens of billions of tonnes that people think that you can go out and mine. So questions we've been asked to address would be, how can you come up with a rational policy for energy? The elements are going to be things like using less energy has to be a good idea if we can find a way of doing that. In particular, where we're using biomass or fossil fuels, and there's a heat generation component, distributed generation, combined heat and power, to me always fits in as part of the mix. I would say very strongly that you have to use renewables when they're available to be used. Not everybody likes that, and that then says, well, what's going to pick up the variation in the middle and match supply to demand? I think the basket of renewables that we choose to use will change over time. There are ones that are simply not economic today, like large-scale wave power, tidal stream power and whatnot. It'll be a number of decades before they become mainstream. Other ones are really available there today. So you'll see a shift in the basket of renewables that are being used over time. That makes sense. Nuclear, yes, I've mentioned that. It could fit in somewhere in the electricity picture. There's a big role, as far as I'm concerned, for fossil fuels linked to carbon capture and storage, and that's for both oil and for gas. I think we can't protect, particularly where countries are playing two strengths and they're all different. I think there's a strong case for thumping big interconnectors between the right combinations of countries. And you need some kind of energy storage, whether you're storing gas, storing hydrogen, storing biomass, but you have to have some element of storage in the picture. And don't forget that transport has to be part of this. I was speaking to the head of technology development at Nissan all about their electric car aspirations. And he was saying that even in his most optimistic pipe dreams, the best he can see is half the vehicles in 2050 as electric vehicles and the other half still internal combustion engines running on liquid fuels. So that has to be part of that has to be part of the mix. One of the biggest, the issues, I'll not go into them in detail, there simply isn't a sense of urgency. You have people trying to solve three different problems. You have gross misinformation. You've got serious delays with planning systems. You've got serious costs of connecting into a grid that was not designed to be used backwards, which is what we're trying to do. And the biggest problem of all, a lack of stability in the incentives and regulatory environments that governments around the world are putting in place. We saw it in the UK when we introduced a renewable transport fuel obligation with a 5% target for 2010, and 2 months later we'll move it to 2013. Having built the biggest biodiesel plant in the world and the biggest bioethanol plant in Europe, you just can't do that with investors. So the one problem I would try to solve would be creating stability for investors. An agreed carbon price would be fantastic. Can't see that coming in a hurry, but any one government can always say, for your big investment, we will agree that if we change the carrots and the sticks that incentivize this investment, it won't affect your investment during its financial lifetime in an adverse way, and that would make a big difference.
Thank you, Dermot. I'm going to call upon Hervé Coutrix to speak next. He began his career as a geophysicist, moving quickly to interpretation and management positions related to geosciences. Working in a variety of roles in Africa, Northern Europe, and South America, he is a member of the Total Exploration Council and the Vice President of Structural and Sedimentological Interpretation, Total in Port, France, a post he has held since 2007. Prior to that, he spent 2 years as Deputy Vice President for the Geoscience Technology Division of Total, followed by 4 years Geosciences Manager for Total Austral, is that correct?
Yes, in Argentina.
Which was based in Argentina. He was also worked for several years for the oil company ELF in France, the Netherlands, and the Gabon. And there is a talk that you wish to use.
Yes.
And here is your pointer. Yes. So that is the indicator, and that's the move.
Okay. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I just extract some slides from a big presentation about world oil production peak. Just not to give you a statement, but more information and some data just to feed the debate that we have after. So I think that when we are dealing with energy, in fact, the main driver of energy is world population. If you look at that graph, you can see that, in fact, world population increased, in fact, in the two last centuries, from 80s, 90s, and 2000. Today, we are 6 billion of people. And the 6 billion people need energy. But tomorrow, if we project in 20 years, we will be more or less 9 billion of people. These 9 billion of people will consume energy. And if we correlate the consumption of energy more or less in a simple way between the GDP and we extrapolate the energy demand, we will see that if today we need, at worldwide scale, more or less 250 million BOE per day, we will need in 2030, if we don't change, if we do not change anything, more or less 350 million barrels per day. That's the figures. We take into account that figures a more efficient use of energy. But even with that, we need 100 million BOE per day more. We can believe me or not, but we can look to the past. What happened in the past between the year 60s and 2007? Here you have the global consumption of the world. We multiply by 2, by 3 the consumption in 40 or 30 years. Second point, most of the increase of energy production was coming till 2000 from gas and oil. From 2000, coal replaced and played as a swinger for the increase in energy consumption. This is not by lack of investment in the oil industry. Here you have the graph of the exploration and production investment. And you can see that from 2000 till today, we multiply by 4 the investment in the exploration production. But even with that, the global world production of petrol is more or less capped to 80 to 90 million BOE per day. Why? If we look at what we have underground, here you have the results. And you can see that from the 80s, unfortunately, the production curve crosses the discovery curves, which means that from 80s, we find each year less than we produced. Another way, we are consuming our reserves of hydrocarbons. Here we did, within Total, a forecast of what could be the oil and gas production in the future, based on our knowledge of all the fields known within the world and the investments that we can do. What we can see is that more or less the conventional crude oil production, even including extra heavy oil and condensate, we will cap till 2030 between 90 and 100 million barrels per day. We will have a little bit more increase in the gas production because we have more reserves of gas today, and we will reach a level of 70 million BOE per day. The sum of both will represent 170. Remind that in the projection of the world population growth in 2030, we will need, it's an approximation, 350 billion BOE per day. That's in another form. We stack all the information that we have with the information about production. You can see, is there a laser here? Ah, yes, okay, it's perfect. You can see the part due to oil and gas. You can see that from today till 2030, more or less, we won't be able, even with huge investment, to increase the oil and gas production. We will increase it of 10%, no more. And after, we can expect a decline of 8 to 5% per year. Coal will increase, even adding what we can expect from the renewable energy, we won't reach the 330 that we need. So we have to change something. We have to change something in our way of life, in our way of consuming energy, because we cannot feed 9 billion of people in 2030 with the energy that we have. That is not, just a point for the climate. A lot of things has been said about petrol and oil and gas. Just to give you brief overview, what represents in the world emission the oil and gas part? 33%. Okay, thank you. Just a background for future discussion.
Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce our final position statement. It's by Neil Bowerman. He's a physicist with a background in climate modeling. He was co-founder of Climatico, a group which produced independent analysis of national and international climate change policy, and sat as executive director until January this year. He was a primary media liaison for the UK youth delegation to Copenhagen in 2009, sat on the executive committee and worked as an analyst for the G8 Research Justice Project in the UK, a student-led campaign advocating contraction and convergence, an international framework for reducing global carbon emissions. He has also worked as a fundraiser for International Association for Human Values in Bangalore, India, and was Environment and Ethics Officer at Oxford University Student Union, 2005 to 2007. He is currently doing a doctoral research in atmospheric, oceanic and planetary physics at the University of Oxford, supervised by Dr. Miles Allen, on the topic of understanding human influence on extreme weather risk. So, Neil.
So I stand before you as someone who at Copenhagen was frantically trying to balance the two jobs that I had. On the one hand, I was manning the Oxford University stall, presenting the research that we've been doing in our group. On the other, I was working with the UK Youth Climate Coalition, giving interviews and echoing the voice of millions of young people in the UK. But I stand here today casting aside those two affiliations, simply as someone who is trying to campaign to avoid dangerous climate change there in Copenhagen. The research that I was presenting was on carbon budgets. Some of you may be familiar with the handful of papers that came out last year showing that humanity has a carbon budget of 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide that can be emitted over time if we want to avoid a best guess warming of 2 degrees C. So 1 trillion tons, or 1 teraton of carbon. In 1992, we'd burnt just over a third of that budget. Today, in 2010, it's over half. In 1992, we knew about the problem. In the Rio Earth Summit, we formed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I was 5 years old then, and in kindergarten, we learnt about the problem. We drew pictures of an Earth that was sweating, and cars producing some smoke, and factories. And our teacher also told us about the solutions. And we drew wind turbines, and we learnt about the types of energy-efficient light bulbs that might one day come out. And I painted my picture, and I stuck it up on the wall, just like many of you will have done here at EGU with your posters, outlining the problem we face, and putting out some ideas as to how we could avoid them. You'll see this t-shirt I'm wearing here, which is one that we normally wear when we meet ministers in the UK. It says, "How old will you be in the year 2050? I hope we won't still be here discussing this same problem and wondering if global emissions are going to peak soon." We as a scientific community warned of this problem in the 80s, or some might even say earlier, and yet there's still no sign of that global emissions will be peaking anytime soon. We still haven't seen the kind of change in energy production that we need. We can sit here and we can come up with a plan for what global emissions should be by which date and which technologies we should be using to get there. But unfortunately, the world's probably not going to play out like that. We've been asked here to question not only the choices we have, but the barriers we face. And that's what I'd like to discuss now. We have to ask ourselves, why haven't we seen this change despite knowing about it for so long? Whether we like it or not, scientists, economists, academics, we're not the only influence on climate and energy policy. And I'm going to argue here today that it's public opinion and lobbyists and others who have as much and probably more influence than we have on changing those impacts. For example, in the week running up to Copenhagen, with my Oxford hat on, I had a meeting to discuss carbon budgets with the science advisor to the energy and climate change minister. One meeting with the science advisor. With my public opinion UK Youth Climate Coalition hat, we had 4 or 5 meetings, not with the science advisor, but with the ministers and the chief negotiators. They would ask us, how many people do you have on your mailing list? How many people are going with you to Copenhagen? They seem to care more about where the public opinion lay than the facts and the science of the situation. I also wonder if part of the reasons that we had so many meetings with them was because we were wearing these cool blue t-shirts that look nice in photos. But public opinion has influence, and so do lobbyists. A friend of mine was at a recent climate change negotiation where he walked into his hotel, and in the lobby there was a group of people sitting. As he walked past them, they all went deadly silent. And he looked over and realized that it was 2 famous oil, gas, and coal lobbyists briefing the Saudi delegation on the moves that they should be making in the upcoming negotiations. So it's clear, public opinion and lobbyists and others have a huge influence on the process that we have to go through here. Now, I'm very pleased we're having this debate here, because these are important ideas and these are important things that must be discussed. But I'd like to move these ideas out of the academic sphere and into public consciousness, because otherwise we're not going to be seeing action on what the UK chief scientist has called the defining issue of our generation. Thank you very much.
I think you'll agree with me that was 3 excellent summaries. I'm trying to summarize. I'm left with a feeling that with all the common thing was that there was some optimism as well as some pessimism. So it's maybe it's the balance between them that needs to be picked up. And it seems to me like we have choices to be made, and that those choices must be made now. I think all 3 of you have said that. I don't know if, Dermot, you want to respond to what else you heard. Can we have microphones?
Okay, I have to switch it on.
Okay, whilst we wait for the microphones to be switched on.
Hello?
That's it, that's good.
Okay. I haven't heard much so far that I want to disagree with. In terms of what Hervé was saying, I've seen similar forecasts around peak oil or a plateauing rate of production of oil from BP, from Shell. They can't all be right, or they can't all be wrong. I mean, so from that point of view, demand is certainly going to outstrip ability to supply, and we do have to do something different. The only area where I might have portrayed the thing differently is I think there is an opportunity in unconventional use of coal, which would allow coal to actually feature much more prominently in those forecasts. But despite all of that, it still comes back to the point that we do have to do something different, because even with unconventional use of coal, you can't solve the problem indefinitely. In terms of what Neil was saying, I can only agree. There's no sign of CO2 emissions figures falling, except in one sector. In the UK, it's falling in the heating sector, and that's because you can regulate and force people to build a different type of building with a different kind of heat performance, but you can't stop them buying plasma screen television sets and all sorts of other things. And we've failed miserably when it comes to transport. I think that the point about public opinion is very valid, and very sound. Where I've seen it work very badly in reverse was having finally hauled the UK government onto to what I believe firmly was the right page in terms of responsible ways, sustainable ways of using biofuels. Badly informed public opinion dragged them back off that page again, and it's very hard to get them back again. So it's very powerful, either when it's on your side or when it's in opposition.
Hervé would like to respond to anything. You're okay. Neil, do you wish to say anything before we? Or maybe we should use Dermot's microphone.
Yeah. I just want to stress this idea of generation being location-specific. I think what you were saying earlier about different countries and different regions having different capacities for different energy types is something we often forget. And that's very important. And the other idea I'd like to throw out there is this kind of conflict between the kind of economic and academic sphere versus public opinion, which is something I personally am interested in. We've shown time and time again that the tools we have available to us to create changes in policy are, first of all, attacks on things like carbon or whatever it is. The second one is to create a permit system. And the third one is regulation. Now, public opinion generally hates attacks, is kind of lukewarm about a permit, and don't mind so much regulation because they don't think it affects them as much. Even though the price does actually come down to them, they see it as further off and not affecting them so much. So public opinion actually prefers regulation and then a permit and then a tax, which shows you the kind of academically optimum answer being in complete conflict with public opinion. And that's something I think we need to address. And that's why I'm pleased we're discussing these issues here today.
Right. We're going to have 2 roving mics. I'm going to take 3 or 4 questions together, and then I'm going to ask the panel to respond. So we may, depending on how many hands go up, we may have to zonate and apportion the questions. So do we have questions? Okay. It would seem that maybe this section over here would be okay. Keep your hands up, please. Do you want to go over there as well? Go to the next person.
I like what Neil had to say about public opinion. It brings me back to my early days as an undergraduate in the mid-'70s and reading a book by Paul Ehrlich about the tragedy of the commons. And it seems to me that 30-some-odd years later, we're still dealing with this same issue, the tragedy of the commons. It's our air, it's our water. And people only think about their own backyard. And so from a matter of public perception and public opinion, how do you deal with that?
Okay. Next person, please.
I think when this debate is going to be about future of energy, I think we are not talking about fossils at all, because fossils are the past and not the future. And I think there's no aim to try to burn anything that's on this planet. So I think the whole discussion on the possible exploits of future oil is misleading. I was expecting something like how can we get our countries in Europe to build a big net for high voltage transport of renewables from those regions where they are optimally to be gained. So in this direction I was expecting this debate, and I would ask the discussants on this,
Okay,
on their opinion.
One more question. Over here somewhere. Hands back up again. It's coming.
Well, completely disagree with the previous opinion. This is a debate. 61% of energy in our planet is produced from oil and gas. And the energy for the next century will be oil and gas energy. Just a comment. My question is, do you know how big is pollution, CO2 pollution, from all volcanoes all over the world in, let's say, 2008? And how big is pollution from all our plants, all our vehicles in 2010? Or 2000, in the same year. Thank you.
Okay, now I'll just try and sum that up. The first essence is 30 years of inertia, I think, even though we know we don't change, and maybe we need to comment on that. And just a direct question, it's either, are we going to get rid of our fossil fuels? That seems sensible to me. Or is it just a dream? And as the final question has pointed out, there must be lots of other carbon coming from other places as well. I don't know who would like to go first.
Happy to have a go.
Oh, Green, I think
switched on?
Yeah, go.
Yeah, it is, okay. Oh, right. I can only agree with the point about the 30 years of inertia. Some of it, I think, is because of bad information. My father was told at school in 1944 that within 25 years the world would have run out of oil. Whereas what we actually know is the world will never, ever run out of oil. It'll just become too expensive to recover. And so that doesn't help. When you add that to, but you hear statements as well like, we haven't actually put the major countries of the world on a war footing to do something about this. You know, it's a much more leisurely academic armchair debate approach and so on, which allows the not in my backyard type of reaction to flourish. Should we be burning fossil fuels at all? Well, I guess people know where I'm coming from because of what I said. I think that if you look far enough in the future, we'll say that we have actually used up what we can cost effectively use in terms of the fossil fuels that were created 150 million years ago. And by that time, we need to have found some alternative. I simply can't believe that idealism from developed countries in Europe is actually going to stop the countries to which we have exported our CO2 emissions to stop burning fossil fuels. The reason that we produce, as a large economy in Britain, only 2.5% of the world's CO2 emissions is because we buy all our white goods from China. And they're building coal-fired power stations to manufacture the things that we don't manufacture ourselves. But I think we have to view it as a bridge to a renewable energy economy rather than a stopgap measure that we hope lasts forever and ever and ever.
Thanks. Neil?
Thanks. So, a month or two ago, I was speaking at a public inquiry which was deciding whether or not they should install a wind farm in Bedfordshire in southern England. And the man that came up and spoke before me gave this, what I thought was a really nice analogy of that in the southeast of England during World War II, there was 800 airstrips installed over the course of about between 3 and 5 years that were installed there. And he looked back through the records and he couldn't find a single person writing a letter of complaint about these airstrips because he knew that they had to be built. And yet today, if you even propose the idea of having a wind turbine, which is arguably a lot less noisy than an airstrip near your house, you'll get hundreds of letters of complaint coming through. And so to answer your question, because I thought it was a really good one, I agree it's quite a big problem. And one of the solutions that is being played with is this idea of building a cooperative around the turbine. If the people that are going to be most affected by it own it, then they're a lot more willing to have it in their backyard. And so we've seen this happening in Scotland, for example, to great success. And so communities are actually thriving and very proud of their wind turbines because they're bringing some income into the community.
Thanks. Hervé?
Okay, just maybe to the last one. I think that till the end of the century, we will use quite a lot of gas and oil. I agree with you. But this use will be most focused on transportation, mainly, and when we try to replace the use of oil and gas by other source of energy for the other needs. Next, for the world emission of greenhouse effect gases, I show a plate which come not from Total but from the IEA, which means International Energy Agency. In fact, the greenhouse effect gas coming from hydrocarbons, liquids or grass, represents 30%. Mm-hmm. So we have to do a lot, in fact, more on other sources of energy, biomass, forest, agriculture, and so on, than in oil and gas, for which a lot of things have been done in the past, and most recently in the last 10 years. That's, and our view is more in Total in our projection of world consumption and world production of oil and gas. We have an estimation at 2050, which can be debated a lot, because what will happen in 40 years, not so easy. But we have estimated that 50% of the energy will come from oil and gas.
Thank you. Okay. Any more questions, please? Hands up. We have one at the front here, Mark. Oh. You're hidden just there, aren't you? You're too close to the front.
If you were able to, or say, just for the sake of the argument, freezing the world population at its present state, could you give a figure of what you would envisage as a sustainable level of bulk and world energy consumption? And is there any possibility to produce that from renewables?
Good question. There's a question here at the front, Mark.
My question is roughly the same, so.
We'll ask it again.
Yeah, my question overlaps with the previous speaker. Maybe the bottom line of the entire story is that there's just too many of us, and we should, instead of focusing on extracting as much energy from the world as we can, we should focus on limiting population. It's not very popular, but I think it's a good way to go.
Okay. Hands up, please. I'll come back to you in a second. So.
Hi, I'd like to kind of include the dimension of social justice, because the numbers you've been giving based on current usage is based on a world where most people don't have fresh water, they don't have our access to healthcare, to education, all these things. And if you do the numbers giving a fairer world, maybe a bit less for us, a bit more for other people, the figures are actually rather worse. So I'd like to hear people's view on that impact for the next 20, 30 years of energy use and requirements.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there's enough there to go on in that directly, is there enough potential to use renewable energies directly? Or should we just bite the bullet and try and say, let's have less people on the Earth? There's a bit of geoengineering for you. And some social justice. Once we start to look at what kind of society we're looking at, we're going to have to look very carefully about how we're going to supply that society. Maybe, Neil, you could go first this time.
Sure. On the first question, what is the sustainable output of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere? There was a great paper in 2008 which showed that you've got to have near zero emissions to, once we've emitted our trillion tons, you've got to have about near zero emissions after that per year in order to avoid temperatures rising further. And so in answer to your question about could we use renewables to get down to that near zero point, I don't know. I would doubt it without some pretty big leaps and bounds in technology, which is why I think, at least in the short term, we have to use an energy mix. I would hope that maybe by the year 2100 or later, we may well be able to do that, or we might be able to deal with nuclear waste better, so that we can really have a safe and sustainable energy future. But I think in the meantime, we've got to use a mix, and that's really the way forwards. On this question about the developing world, a couple summers ago, I did an internship at the World Bank, and there was this whole furor in the media at the time about why was the World Bank, which is all about reducing poverty, climate change being something which drives poverty, installing one of the world's largest coal-fired power stations in northern India. And I remember getting quite annoyed about this and speaking to quite a few people while I was there. And in the end, my mentor sat me down over lunch and said, look, Neil, ultimately for these people, having energy is more important for those people living around the coal-fired power station than it is having a cooler climate for them to live in. And that's certainly a point of view that a lot of people take, but I would kind of have to go with the idea that I'd rather someone paid the few extra $1 million in order to make it sustainable energy, so then you can kind of get both the sustainable energy future and the cooler climate that would not exacerbate the condition they're currently living in.
Hervé, do you want to take the microphone?
No, just to give you a figure about renewable energies, an estimation of the, another time, IEA said that in 2030, renewable energy would represent 60 billion BOE per day. We need, in fact, 350. That gives you an idea of what we can expect from renewable energy in 2030. I think that if we want to maintain our climate, still having energy for 9 billion people, fresh water, schools, a correct development, a correct standard of life, even in Africa. Do not forget India and China. I think we have to bet on nuclear fusions, something like that. Clean resource, clean energy.
A new technology.
New technology.
Okay. Dermot?
Just to add a few comments. I'm not a supporter of population control, but I will answer the question since it was asked. It has been estimated that if you took the energy that hits the Earth from the sun that falls on a patch of sub-Saharan Africa that's just 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers in size, then the amount of energy that you could generate from solar PV in a year from that is equal to what the whole of the planet consumes. So at that level, you could do it. On the other hand, how do you get the electricity from where you've generated it through unstable countries without it being switched off by maverick dictators to the point where it eventually wants to be used? So there are practical geopolitical problems with that solution. Other people who like a wind solution would say, you start with 500 kilometres by 500 kilometres of ideally placed offshore wind farms in the middle of the North Sea. It gives you the same amount of energy. It gives you similar problems. I think one of the issues with trying to meet everything with renewables is renewables are to varying extents unpredictable or intermittent, and at the moment we haven't found a way of matching our use of energy to when the renewables are available. So there is something needs to buffer that in the middle, and there is an issue of cost. We could do it, but it would be expensive. What you will pick up though is that there is a lifestyle thing here. If we froze the population where it is now, and the whole of the developing world aspired to a Western European lifestyle, you would need 3 planets to provide all the natural resources that they need. And if they aspire to an American lifestyle, you'd need 7 planets. And we've only got 1. So there's an issue there about aspirations, there's something about lifestyle, and it does then impact on social justice, because 2 billion people on this planet have no access to electricity at all. And some of the people in those developing countries will actually be the first serious victims of climate change once we start to see rising sea levels and all the other things that have been predicted. That's why you start to find people saying that we shouldn't be aiming here for a 60% reduction in CO2 by 2050, or even 80%. It should be 90%, so you don't have to be quite so extreme in terms of what you expect developing countries to do. But there are some perverse bits of logic behind all of this. So, for instance, you'll find that the accepted wisdom is, what do you do when a country has a famine? You dump your spare food there. And Oxfam will say, don't do that. Because if that's your long-term policy, wait for a famine to happen and then give them free food, you'll undermine the industry that could be created there and approached in the right way, establishing a biomass industry, a biofuels industry in a country which has never had the economic incentive to develop its agriculture, maybe gets you a less than obvious answer to how you can deliver on social justice and come up with affordable solutions for the world's energy needs at the same time.
Well, it sounds like a if we come up with some new technologies and some new thinking and some big ideas, some ways of connecting the world up, and some nice, ambitious targets. Does that sound nice? Is that dreamy or is that real? More questions, please.
I have a question about clean coal. I wonder, how feasible do you think it is, and if so, on what timescale?
Okay, next question.
Hi. I've not actually heard much on the potential for nuclear power. So usually the debate on nuclear power, both in terms of the impact and the cost, seems to be very polarized by people who are for and against, each one with their own vested interests. So I was wondering what your opinion was.
Okay, and one more. Mark, have you got one?
Hermann Held, Vice President ERE. I have a remark and a question to the panel. First, a remark. Newer calculations on energy economics seem to suggest that, in fact, you can go for very stringent climate targets, for example, the 2-degree targets, without a major loss of economic welfare. So it seems that the climate energy problem can be solved without talking about population control or loss or a dramatic loss of welfare. So this is a very good news. An underlying assumption behind these calculations is, and they are also cited in the Stern report in 2006 and 2007, that you believe in the influence of induced technological change, so that direct investment into low-carbon technologies will drive down the cost heavily. So this is just a remark that some of the conflicts that I discussed here may not be there, in fact. And then the question, suppose we were in a world where there is either a global agreement on a 2-degree target or something similar, or you have a coalition, at least, of countries who aim at such a goal on a global level, what would be the preferred regulative framework for you? So is it a trade and cap and trade system, or what sort of system would you go for?
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, it's clean coal. So Dermot, you get your chance to tell us all about clean coal. We need to get right down to what is our, do we have polarized views on nuclear energy? And we need to think a bit more about the energy economics and investment and regulation. So there's 3 nice, easy questions for you. So Hervé, would you like to respond first?
On clean coal, I don't have any idea clear. I am more a geologist for petrol than for carbon. What I can say is that even with clean coal, I think that the resource of coal are also fossils and limited. So it's a solution, but for short or medium term, not long term. For nuclear, I think that today we are able with H-bomb. We are not able to control the phenomena. But one day, when we will be able to control the phenomena, we will produce energy and water, which will be something, a dream. So I think that the effort done with nuclear and research has to be pursued because it's a solution for the next century. And for the last question, I didn't catch exactly what.
Just the economics and investments and regulation.
Economics, investment, regulation. Today, in fact, I will answer the petrol perimeter. The investment is controlled by the barrel cost, barrel at $80, $100, $120. Each time we have an increase in the cost of the barrel, we invest more in more difficult projects, in more costly projects, in more costly production. So anyway, the solution for the oil and gas as an energy source for the future is cannot be done with stabilized price of the barrel. If you want that a petrol company, IOC or national oil company go to a deeper reservoir, to more difficult reserves, they need a price of the barrel higher. So the control will be between the cost of the barrel and the cost of the renewable energy. Each time that the barrel costs less than renewable energy, the world will go to petrol. And when petrol will reach, for instance, $200 per barrel, that will be kind of a step where we can compare energy coming from sun, from wind, to energy coming from petrol. Okay. So the balance in economic will be that one. So there will be a time in the future, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, where petrol will be in competition with sun and with wind. Okay. And we don't fear about that within Total or within petroleum company, because we are also investing in this kind of energy. Mm-hmm. But this will be the economy, and we need it anyway.
Okay, Dermot?
Okay. On clean coal, the most optimistic estimates I've heard is that you could just about have the world's first full-scale carbon capture and storage plant up and running before the end of 2014. And that date can only drift in one direction, in my humble opinion. But there are plans at the moment across Europe to see a first wave of 10 or so carbon capture and storage plants being built around about 2015, 16, 17. So a lot can be learnt about how they work, how they perform, and to what extent they're over-engineered and therefore too expensive. So the second wave of carbon capture and storage plants can be built in 2020. And I hope that that happens. I think that for the UK's energy mix, the right answer is we should have about 10 of those plants as part of our overall energy mix. So for me, the answer is it should be happening and happening on a large scale, but probably on those time scales. It takes about 3 years to build from once you've decided you've actually got the investment in place. On nuclear, I guess you do get very polarised views. I had the privilege of spending 2 hours recently being shown around my local nuclear power station by the power station manager. I came away from that thoroughly impressed with the safety of the day-to-day operation there, but I know a lot of people still say nuclear power stations aren't safe. I'm absolutely convinced that in the right country with the right regulations, they can be operated safely in terms of day-to-day performance. I still have a concern, even in squeaky clean UK, about the answers we're offering for nuclear waste storage. And that's really because, although I'm not a geologist, I would expect a bunch of geologists to decide what's the best site in the UK in which to store long-term, highly radioactive waste. The government policy is to ask for a volunteer community who won't object, and I think that's all wrong. But I am worried about the signal that we send from countries where I'm happy to see nuclear power deployed, because that it's the universal solution to be deployed all over the world, because I do have serious concerns about some countries allowing nuclear materials to leak into a weapons program, or not operating their plants to the safe standards that a European country would expect to operate to. On the investment cost comment that was made, I think that's a very telling comment. I remember how much it cost me to buy my first electronic calculator, how much it cost me to buy my first digital watch, and now they give them away for free at conferences because they're cheap. We're starting to, but we look at something like fuel cells, fantastic device, but practically every one is a handcrafted artifact at the moment. They're not mass-produced, so they're hugely expensive. Wind turbines are starting to get there. Even my children, if you ask them, what's a wind turbine, they say it's a thing with 3 blades rotating about a horizontal axis. That's been settled. When you get the equivalent question, what's a wave power device, you could draw 30 or 40 completely, totally different concepts and say that would harness wave energy. Well, we're a million miles away from mass-producing wave devices because we haven't even decided what's the wave equivalent of the 3-bladed turbine.
Thanks, Neil.
Thanks. So I'm going to talk mainly on this question of economic frameworks because one of the things I did a few years ago was run a campaign promoting contraction and convergence, which is it's a global framework where you allocate emission rights to everyone in the world equally, and then but that's, at the moment you allocate them, we call it grandfathering, as countries are emitting. So at the moment you wouldn't have to make any immediate changes, but over time you'd have to move to every country in the world having an equal right to emit. Then you can sell those permits to other countries that are emitting more or less in exchange for money. And so that creates an international carbon market, which would drive down the price of renewables and other low carbon technologies. So this has actually formed the basis of most of the developed country emission reduction targets that you've seen. They're all based on this idea that, well, everyone in the world should be allowed to emit roughly the same amount per person, which is why in the UK we're going down to an 80% cut, and whereas the global average is about 50%. But the problem with a scheme like this is that if you try and go to the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and get 192 countries to agree on how low they should reduce their emissions, or how fast they should converge to an equal per capita allowance, basically how quickly you give everyone an equal share, there's complete disagreement. And because of the power of veto in that arm of the UN process, you'd never get an agreement. So I think what's more likely, which is fortunate or unfortunate depending on how you look at it, is that we're going to get an agreement between the major emitters, who will then probably end up putting trade barriers against carbon-intensive goods and taxing those goods coming into their countries. And you're going to see competition develop in that way. I don't think that's the optimum way to do it, but I think that's probably the way that things are panning out, the way that they're going, if that makes any sense.
Okay, I think that is reinforcing the fact that if we are going to address and get real about the issue, we're going to have to start building the things and trialing the things that we expect to be taken over in the future. So whilst we have new ideas, we have to start building some big demonstration power plants and have confidence in those power plants. And maybe the same is true of any economic regulatory system. We're going to have to trial it first and find out if it works. Questions, please. We've got, where are our mics at the moment? And is there? We'll have a posse from the front, I think.
Hi, I'm not an economist, but I'm a geologist. But still, I would like to emphasize the role of the oil companies, actually, in this debate and about energy. Because actually, from my point of view, still an oil company is an oil company and wants to sell oil until the last drop. But still, oil companies now really put actually their effort in making up the renewables department, and at least they show the outside world that they are actually involved in this debate and actually that they have an objective opinion. So they put some money, but actually if you look at the numbers, maybe in renewables, like a company like Shell, they put a few million in this. Well, actually the billions and billions are in investigation still of oil. So I wonder actually how we as society, why should we put our coins on these oil companies that maybe they will find out actually how to solve problems, and also especially like put the debate on CO2 storage, which I think actually is really pretty misleading and really a voice from the oil companies themselves. How can we be objective as a society without giving too much power to these multinationals?
Isa?
Yes, I'm from New Zealand. I've done a lot of work with people who live off-grid. That is, they generate their own electricity. And this is something I've noticed with all of these people. Their consumption of electricity goes down dramatically because they're in tune with exactly what they're generating. And it's very like having a bank account. You know what your income is, you know what your expenditure is. And all of the discussion today, I haven't really heard anyone talk about reducing personal energy consumption. And it's my guess that probably most of the people sitting here today have no idea how much electricity they use in a day. And by the way, Neil, to answer the question on your T-shirt, I'll be 100 years old in 2050. Thank you.
Okay, we may burn you as biomass then. Just a question at the back. We're going to be ultra efficient in the future.
Hi. Given that the UK's best reduction in CO2 emissions has come from a period of economic contraction. To what extent is it possible for countries to rebuild their national economies and individuals to rebuild their personal economies to reduce overall CO2 emissions without actually completely restarting?
Good point. I just wanted to make a comment. The farmers that we've given renewable energy to immediately become energy conscious and immediately reduce their consumption, which is, so if they do have micro renewables, you get a double hit. Right, so the three questions. We have the oil companies. Hervé may suggest that they're already taking responsibility, but should we force them to take a greater responsibility? We've had the off-grid and just the perception of consumption. And then we have an opportunity caused by economic recession. I think it's Dermot first this time.
This is the working one. I've worked for an oil company myself before, but this is an oil company that did oil refining, but they bought all their crude oil in the open markets. So I've never really considered myself part of big oil, where you make most of your money in oil exploration. But I have wondered for years, particularly when BP and Shell, in contrast with Exxon, were talking up their level of interest in solar and hydrogen and fuel cells and wind and whatnot. And then in more recent times, we've seen them both retrench back closer to home territory. They'll say, biofuels, yes, that's close to oil, but really we're pulling our horns back in again when it comes to a lot of the other aspirations that we enunciated around alternatives to oil. And maybe they're ending up not too far removed from where Exxon declared themselves to be unashamedly right from the very beginning. But on the other hand, as someone who, for a number of years, worked very, very hard to get biofuels onto garage forecourts in the UK via independence on a shorter time scale than the oil majors wanted to do, it reinforced the view in my mind that there's a lot to be said for the art of judo. And if somehow or other you find a way of harnessing the sheer strength of these thumping big oil companies and get them on side, you will make a lot more progress, a lot more quickly than if you tried to go into head-to-head competition with them, however idealistic you might be. When it comes to distributed generation, generating your own electricity and reducing personal consumption, I guess nobody argues against it. You just don't see very many examples of it happening in practice. But I've been reading about some of this just on the plane on the way over today. And the author of this particular book was taking a slightly maverick approach and saying that actually when it comes to things like wind energy and solar energy, you shouldn't actually set out to reduce your consumption at all, at least not as your primary aim, because the resources you're using are free. No, the wind is going to blow whether you harness its power or whether you don't. And it's quite different to the whole mindset we have in the energy world, where we say we're used to business models where you're consuming a finite resource and you're paying for that resource, whether it's coal, oil or gas. You don't actually pay for the wind, you don't pay for the sun. What you do have to get your money back on is the money you've invested in the equipment. And so he was suggesting quite strongly that we've got completely the wrong business model if we're trying to move straight from the things that make economic sense with fossil fuels to the things that make economic sense when the fundamental resource you're using is actually something which is free and there in abundance. You're just wondering how to harness it. On rebuilding economies, I like the idea that came out in the United States that of all the things you would want to invest money in, when you're trying to kickstart your economy, you invest a lot of it in energy infrastructure. Because I think a lot of the energy infrastructure that was built in the past by governments for nationalised companies and so on is being used at the moment to prop up the old energy solutions that we're trying to phase out. So at least if we can, insofar as there's any money around to be invested in kickstarting construction and other industries, the more of that we can pile into creating the infrastructure that's needed for low carbon energy, the happier I'll be.
Maybe Hervé, can you respond?
Yes. Just an answer, just to say that in fact, I think that we are in 2010, we are no more like 20 or 30 years ago in a period of rough capitalisms, where an oil company or company are just here to make money, and on top of that, oil companies. I think that today the philosophy of all the companies and also oil company, and especially for Total, which I can represent today, we consider that we are no more an oil company but an energy company, and that our role outside giving some money to our shareholders, it's also to participate and to contribute in a sustainable way of producing energy and giving energy for the future to the world. This is the philosophy more or less of the company, always in an economic way, because we have no state behind us to give us money. So we are obliged to win money with what we do in order to finance and to invest in other projects. So this is why oil companies are working today. I think that not only the case of Total, I think that the philosophy also of Exxon, of Total, of BP, of Shell, because there is no more room for only capitalisms today and only making money, enter in a country. Most of the oil companies are working abroad, Europe or United States. We are working in Africa, in Asia. And main part of our contract sometimes consists in the development of the country, creating school, and so on. So I think that even as a geologist, you can work in an oil company and see that you are doing a lot of sustainable development. And we consider that energy is one of our problems of tomorrow. And we invest for that also in some renewable energy. We are not investing in Total in wind because we think that wind is not the best solution. We are investing in sun. And we use the benefits coming from oil and gas to develop new technology in solar cells and so on.
Thank you. Neil?
So I want to begin by thanking the man that brought up reducing our energy consumption and energy efficiency as a way of tackling this problem. You're right, the low-hanging fruit, that's where they lie. If you look at the McKinsey cost curve, which is a brilliant piece of work that outlines how much it's going to cost you to cut each ton of CO2 emissions, and it ranks them from the cheapest to the most expensive. You'll see that all the cheapest ones, in fact, they don't actually cost money, they save you money, are all in the energy efficiency realm. And so I agree, that's the first place we need to look. On oil companies and power and influence, the main stats I have here are actually for BP in the light of the oil spill off the coast of the Gulf, which is that BP spends £11 million a year on lobbying, and it also spends £500,000 on US federal elections each time they come round. And so it's clear that in order to have the level of influence that the companies want to have, in order to see the policies that are going to benefit those companies, that's the kind of money that they have to spend. And so it does leave me sometimes wondering if companies that can't afford those kind of sums, smaller say, renewable companies, if they're going to be able to compete without putting those kind of sums of money into lobbying. Because ultimately, if we want to see a creation of green jobs, if we want to see this point about GDP and the growth of green jobs, we're going to have a policy framework that supports that. GDP and carbon emissions are very tightly in lockstep. You can see when the GDP goes up by a few percent, the emissions go up by a few percent. And so we've got to break that lockstep. And the way to do that is by allowing companies, oil companies, renewable companies, all the companies, to have this opportunity to create green jobs, that's where we need to go.
Excellent. Questions? We have some at the front here, a posse at the front.
Well, thank you. One comment is that, as far as I know, in Europe, 27 countries, last year 62% of the new installed capacity was renewables, mainly wind and PV. And also the year before, 2008, the majority of new capacity was renewables. Well, and then when you compare that to the EU target of 20 renewables by year 2020, that will very easily be reached. In fact, it's not an ambition goal at all. So I'd like your comment about the European policy on energy.
Yeah, my question relates a bit to the last part of the discussion. I have some numbers from 10 years ago, correct me if I'm wrong, but in countries like the Netherlands and Norway, it's the governments who get the lion's share of the money that's earned by extracting oil and gas from the subsurface. So I guess it's wrong to blame only oil companies. It's the government who create the climate. And as long as governments have a huge profit from this oil and gas, will they actually promote sustainable energy?
Hello there. We've all just gone through a period where we've seen lots of big governments throwing billions of pounds here and there to solve debt crises. But supposing each of the panel members had £1 billion to invest in a scientific program of some type, what would they do with it?
Thank you very much. Neil, would you like to tackle that easy question?
Sure. The first question on the EU renewables policy, I was really pleased actually to hear those stats you put out there. It put a smile on my face. Unfortunately, in the UK, we're not on track to reach our renewable targets. And so I think in the UK, there's a lot more effort needed. Part of the problem, I think, is the policy regime that in places like Germany, they installed feed-in tariffs, whereas in the UK, we tried to use renewable obligation credits, which just didn't work as well. Yeah, I think if countries on the continent are going to be meeting their targets, then perhaps you're right in suggesting they should be higher. And I think that countries like the UK need to put more effort into it. This question on will governments promote sustainable energy, I think they will if there's public opinion behind it. If they're going to get kicked out of office for not doing it, then they've got to take action or lose out. And I think that's really where the incentive lies. Yeah, I'll pass it on.
Dermot. Sorry.
All right. I don't recognise your particular figures for the percentage of renewable energy produced last year or whatever. What I do, the general message that I tend to pick up from people is that this 2020 target, we want 20% reduction in CO2 and 20% renewables by 2020, is actually going to tax countries very hard. Certainly will in the UK. In the UK, we've managed to wriggle out of a 20% figure and get it down to 15%. But that's because we were starting off at 2.5% a year ago. You do, though, hear people quoting barrages of statistics at one another, and you wonder how they can be so contradictory. Sometimes it's because one person is talking about energy and another person is talking about electricity, and they don't actually realise they're talking about two completely different things, and there's maybe a factor of 3 difference between the two. So, but I can't give a more concrete answer to your question. I would love to be able to, because generally I'm on top of numbers. But in terms of using the money that's made from oil and gas and investing that in accelerating renewables, I think that was a major missed opportunity with the North Sea deposits that the UK and Norway had. When people tot up all the types of tax that government levies, right the way through from exploration and through to refined oils and taxing those, and VAT, the level of tax on crude oil is 78%. Now, when a government is getting that amount of revenue from the oil that was found and used in the North Sea, and similar things with gas, why on earth wasn't some of that hypothecated, to use the accountant's term, and used to actually promote the things that we should be trying to accelerate now? What we have tried to do in the northeast of England, where we've been seeking to get major support for some work on underground coal gasification linked to carbon capture and storage, is we've proposed a model right from the outset where if we can actually make that work on a commercial basis, you should actually be levying a tax on that, and specifically hypothecating that to use to accelerate R&D programs in the pure renewable sector. So it is not just some kind of smoke and mirrors argument that this is just a bridge to a renewable energy future. You should actually be using the money that you can make from clean, unconventional use of coal, because we've missed the boat in the UK on oil and gas. Use the money you can actually make from clean, unconventional use of coal to actually genuinely and directly accelerate development of the technologies which are for pure renewables. If I had $1 billion to spend, what would I do? I think that the graph that I've seen recently that shocked me most, I saw it in December last year, was one that showed total UK research and development spend in the energy sector from 1970 through to the present day, and it's fallen to about 5% now of what it was then. That's because we cut all the research into nuclear fission and didn't put the money into anything else in the energy sector. So if I was feeling incredibly altruistic and wearing my university professor hat, I would say, well, I would want to invest that money in proper research, because there are other pots of money for commercializing new ideas once they've been developed at a certain level. But we're miles behind of where we need to be in terms of just research in energy generally. If you pinned me to the wall and said, I want you to pick a specific sector, I would go for the Cinderella area of underground coal gasification, partly because I do a lot of work on it myself, but partly because the sheer scale of the economic opportunity, if we can make that work, is absolutely mind-blowing.
Hervé.
Okay, not a lot of things to add to what have been said. Just maybe to precise the 78%, because I just have the figure just below. With 1 barrel of petrol, $100 per barrel, 70% go to the government. That's part of an answer to you. 10% to the production company, and 50% are the technical cost. With that barrel, you make super gasoline diesel. With 1 liter at the pump price, the government of a different country, not the producing country, takes 60%. Refining and marketing, 10%, and the rest are the cost of the previous barrel, which represents 30% of the cost at the pump price. Which means that, in fact, a huge part of the money coming from oil go, in fact, to the government, and we can say, okay, we can do with that money something else. That's true, but I don't think that the government take holidays with that money. They use it for school, for a lot of things. So we have to make arbitration between these different things and, for instance, research on renewable energy. This is, and for the rest, I think that I have nothing to add to what I've said.
Okay. So if we had £1 billion, then maybe that's not very much in the oil sector. Maybe we should just spend it on an education program so we can actually get our facts right and give all the rest to Dermot to research some clean technologies. Some more questions, please. This is coming to the end pretty soon. So we'll go over to this side, I think, near Mark.
Yes, I was going to ask a question about CCS, and it's got to do with the energy penalty of doing the procedure. The best question, when I've asked this question to experts, the answer I get is about every ton of coal that you are going to burn and then store the CO2 requires about 1/3 of a ton more in order to do it. And so there's various inefficiencies in this whole process. I just wondered whether any of you could confirm that general figure and then answer the question as to whether this is a wise use of coal resources in the long term.
Thank you. And hands up again. The lady here.
My question is, how much is the energy problem not correlated with economic failure? The free market is not really efficient the way it works now. We transport 2 million tons of pig meat to Australia and we import the same amount. So, I mean, and the economic theories that we use are 200 years old. We're not informed about the products we use. We don't know how much energy are in them. So I think the economic system is actually one of the biggest problems, and I would like to know your view about that.
Mm-hmm. Another question? This gentleman here is close by.
Well, thank you very much for your answers. It's not very easy to be the encyclopedical vocabulary and answer the wide spectrum of questions. But anyway, I would like to repeat my question. Do you know how many tons of greenhouse is polluted from volcanoes in our planet? If you do not, do you know people who knows? If you do not, have you heard that there are some expert who knows it? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll answer that one. I don't know it, but whatever it is, it will be set within some sort of risk framework. And so, you know, I don't want to get all Donald Rumsfeld on you here, but there's some things we do not know, and that's why we have management frameworks to manage risk. Okay, so inefficiencies, we might need to clarify that. And clearly, we need to revisit our economics, probably. We need to know just how much energy is in things. We might need some new frameworks to help that. And just to touch upon, do we actually know where the greenhouse gases are coming from? You don't have to put it down to any decimal places. Neil, would you like to go first?
Sure. So on this first question of CCS, I've heard similar figures to the ones that you're quoting. And whether this is a wise use of coal, from my understanding, coal is the most abundant fossil fuel that we have available. And so some might argue that in many ways it's not going to run out for a couple hundred years. And so it's okay to use it for that purpose while we develop renewables. That's one argument. On this question of economic theories, I've heard economists say that climate change is the greatest market failure that capitalism has ever seen, which is essentially because it's an externality that we don't have, that we're not pricing within current kind of economic systems. So if we're able to put a price on carbon, for example, that's a very easy way of drawing climate change from outside the market system that we have into it. And it makes it fall kind of within the market framework that we're also used to buying and selling within. So if you're looking to stay within current economic doctrine, that's one way that you could do it. On your question of volcanoes and plants, I don't know the figures precisely, but off the top of my head, it's only a couple % or less of relative to anthropogenic emissions that comes from volcanoes. Again, this is all just off the top of my head. But if you look at the IPCC fourth assessment report, all the numbers are in there. From plants, we do actually get emissions from plants. You're right, but we get about as much absorbed by the biosphere. There is a feedback in that. And so as temperatures heat up, plants are actually going to start emitting more carbon dioxide relative to the amount that they absorb in the future if temperatures heat up, which is another reason why we need to cut carbon emissions quickly.
Hervé?
Yes, I have no answer on CCS because it's not my... I just would like to answer to the economic model. I fully agree with you. Exporting sometimes some rough product to be refined, I don't know, in China, then to re-import them. It's clear that that model cannot survive in 30 or 40 years because lack of energy. I think that all the economic model based on delocalization, transportation should be revised in the light of the cost of energy and the cost of green emission and so on. So we have to try to produce more locally, limit transportation at the maximum level. And I think that when 2 years ago the barrel was at $150 and the price of the jet plane ticket and so on increased strongly in a short time, we have seen in 1 month or 2 months a variation in the importation that you can find in supermarket. And I think that strawberry in winter in Europe will disappear.
Damn it.
I've seen all sorts of contradictory figures on CO2 emissions, and they don't add up. But what I have seen people talk about all of the natural sources of CO2 emissions from plants, from volcanoes and whatnot, and the natural absorbers of CO2 like oceans and so on, which within certain limits can do that without leading to acidification. And people are then arbitrating on what proportion of CO2 emissions on this planet are man-made. What proportion is anthropogenic and what proportion is just natural. The thing about the ones that are just natural is they have found a long-term equilibrium. So the ocean pH has come out wherever the ocean pH has come out based on the background level of CO2 emissions that you get. Then we're saying by using 150 million-year-old coal, oil and gas, in a very short space of time, we're suddenly emitting a lot very suddenly and upsetting the balance. And then they go off and write a paper on the subject. The other place where you find data on this is in the IPCC report that Neil refers to, where they say, no, the exam question is a slightly different one, is how much of the problem that we're forecasting with climate change is due to anthropogenic CO2, and how much is due to other things like sunspot behaviour and whatnot. And the answer they come up with is about 50%. But a lot of these papers end up saying that there are a lot of greenhouse gases, but the dominant one is CO2. There are other sources of CO2, but the one you can do something about and that isn't in balance is the man-made one. And there are other causes of climate change, but the one you can do something about is man-made CO2. And they all seem to home in this neat and tidy figure of it's about 50% of the total is down to us, and the other half you can't do much about. On energy penalties with carbon capture and storage and so on, you can design two completely different integrated gasification combined cycle plants. If you want to design one of them where you're designing for maximum thermal efficiency, then you're going to design for a low gas turbine exit pressure. Whereas if you're trying to design for the lowest possible cost of CO2 capture and the lowest possible cost of subsequent pressurization of CO2 to force it into a geological formation, you come up with a different design. And if you compare one with the other, you can say, yeah, there isn't an energy penalty on the second one compared with the first of somewhere between 25 and 30%. And that's because you're setting out with quite a different aim in mind. One thing that could change that, says he, beating the drum again for underground coal gasification, is that if you choose to store the CO2 in a controlled collapsed coal seam rather than in a saline aquifer, the permeability is 2,000 times better. So you might be able to shave something off that energy penalty if you're going for that particular CO2 sink. But but the broad figure you've got is right. On the other hand, is it a responsible use of coal? I think it's the only environmentally sellable answer, and I think you can actually sell CCS even to China, despite a 25 or 30% penalty. But that's more the pragmatist answer rather than the moralist's answer or the straight economist's answer.
Okay, time has flown. We are supposed to wrap up very soon. I'm going to give an opportunity to our invited speakers to comment on the debate in general, but if I can leave them with the last question is how do we get real about energy? Maybe that would be a good question to finish on. But I'm left with the feeling that there's a time window available to us, and we're going to have to bridge that gap, whatever that gap is, soon, and that we're going to have to think about some new models. I think that's fair enough. So Dermot, just in a minute or two, could you Could you sum up your feeling about the debate?
I hope the things that have come across is that in the hard world of economics and getting people to invest in something which will actually make a difference, you need a healthy dose of pragmatism between what you would love to see people building absolutely tomorrow and what you can get them to build tomorrow, leading to something different. And so I've been peddling more a message about the right renewables in the right place as the right proportion of an overall mix, which has got some other things in it, which we've talked about quite a bit. What I would say is that we probably gave more airtime, which is what usually happens to electricity rather than to heat and to transport. And we have to watch that, because if it's climate change, we're worried about all three are equally problematic. But I think what has come across as well is that approached in the right way, there are manufacturing opportunities, there are jobs in this. And that's the type of thing that helps you get real about energy as well. If people can see some kind of an economic benefit apart from doing the right thing, then they might just follow through on it. I think a message has come through, and it's come through a number of times, that in broad terms we have to play fair by developing countries. And the hard-nosed economist mightn't always do that. How do we get real about it? Of all the things I've said today, the one that I would come back to in direct response to that is, until the day comes when the world's governments are prepared to confront people with the true cost of CO2 emissions, which is about $85 per tonne, Stern said so, but until they're prepared to actually confront people with that, the market will not sort this out. So you have to have government regulation and government incentives. And if those aren't stable enough to give investors confidence to invest in the thing that they're thinking of investing in, you'll have lots of theory, but you really won't have the investment happening on the ground on the scale that drives the costs down. So that's investor confidence and stability is the biggest thing that we need from governments.
Thank you. Hervé, could you go on?
Yes, no, I agree with most of what has been said. Just would like to conclude that more on my perimeter of oil company will say that we will still produce oil and gas for the future and for quite a long term, but in a cleaner way. But anyway, even with that production, we won't be able to produce a lot more than today. And we will need more energy because world population will increase. They need to elevate their standard of life. They need fresh water, as said in the assembly. And we have to change. We have to change. We have to find this new energy, renewable energy, be precautious with our climate change. And on top of that, go further in reducing our consumption of energy, trying to change our economic model, because with the same economic model, only derived by benefit and investment, we will miss something. And try to regulate that, and it's a problem of the government. I think that the GIEC of Copenhagen missed something, but maybe the next one will be the good one.
Mm-hmm. Neil, do you have a visual statement as well?
Yes, I do.
If you can just bring that up whilst you
Thanks.
sum up.
So we have, as I said at the beginning, we have a budget, we have an allowance of 1 teraton of carbon. And if we're to avoid spending that allowance, emissions are going to have to peak and then fall rapidly, quite quickly. Global emissions are going to have to reduce to something like 50% in the year 2050. And if the developed world is to be given its chance to develop, then we're going to have to reduce by something like 80 to 90% by the year 2050. So what's clear with this is we're going to have a kind of a fundamental rethinking of our energy system. And a bunch of the ideas that we've been discussing here today are going to have to be part of that solution. So how do we get real about the energy system? The slide that...
The slide is not...
It's not happening. Okay, no worries.
You've put something too clever in it.
No worries. So essentially, the slide was just going to show you a cartoon about scientists asked the question of what's the impact of climate change? And they study graphs and the IPCC report. And yet, if you ask a politician what's the impact of climate change, he'll look at polling data and public opinion. And so the message that I'd kind of like to leave with you here is that if we're going to see a real change in this, we're going to have government action. And as a result, we're going to have to shift public opinion. And this discussion we've had here today is going to have to continue and grow and move out of this sphere and into the wider world, which is why I'm so glad that the great debate gives us the opportunity to do that. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you very much, everybody. I think you'll all agree with me that that was a fantastic debate, as well as putting our experts on the spot and answering some very difficult questions. So I'd just like to thank them all. And I'd like to thank you for your questions. Thank you very much.